Welcome to the Pulse Wave podcast, where we talk to the people that are helping change the face of GovTech for the better. The Pulse Wave is brought to you by Metronome, we're a modern tech firm that keep outcomes above ego. I'm Virgil Verga, your host of the Pulse Wave. We've got a geospatial data intelligence innovator. He's a data privacy and security whistleblower, and he's a developer of advanced surveillance tools. He didn't hack, intercept, or steal your data. He bought it. Mr. Mike Eagley, thanks for coming on the Pulse Wave. How are you doing today?
Nice to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a little nervous to have you on and talk with you because it's hard when you bring someone on who really doesn't have that many opinions. So hopefully I can drag something out of you today.
Happy to do it.
So data. So I'm curious, before you get into the juicy and the fun stuff, how did you end up like a data wrangler when you were came out of school as just a graduate?
Yeah, with a history degree, which is really useful in this business. So I like that question because I talk to young people all the time, and they're trying to figure out the application of a degree. And coming out of college, I think, with useful skills is critical today, obviously, but it's limiting yourself into sort of a monolithic program of study that's going to then define the rest of your life, I think, is the cage. So I took a liberal arts history degree, was not a coder, was not into computers, or this is back in the 90s. So dial up, and we didn't have the internet. But I think opening up one's aperture and being open to opportunities as they present themselves, and a little bit of luck and being in the right place, right time. So I really started my career in software sales because you could make a lot of money and you needed to be smart, but not necessarily technical. And one thing led to another, and a couple of coders, a couple techies. Back in 1996, we had this awesome idea of fusing weather data into operational business intelligence systems. And so this concept where you could start predicting or understanding the types of inventory you would need to have based upon weather patterns was the first integration of what we call commercially available data or open source data into sort of these proprietary operational systems. And from there, it just took off.
It's interesting. So as far as your story goes, all I know is AdTech forward. So prior to that, what other really cool and interesting data sets did you come up with that got really your toes tingling?
Yeah. So obviously 9/11 was sort of a watershed moment for a lot of us in this space. And looking at the availability of data sets as sort of the source code for pattern indicators, being able to understand or look at outliers that might predict some type of event or some type of emerging event. In that space, the terrorist hunting the intent signals in anything from travel data, airline ticketing data, rental car data, education data, things that were the outliers, the non-obvious data sets to indicate the potential of an emerging threat, is when I really sort of shifted my focus on the national security space.
So you were working on commercial products and interests first. Was it you that said, oh, wow, look, there could be this application here? How did that link happen?
Yeah, that was intentional. Sort of looking at how do I put myself into a space that matters. It's not just about making money, but something that is going to have more of a societal impact. There weren't a lot of people thinking this way.
Yeah, super interesting. When you talk about the AdTech and the data that comes with that and the visualizations that you can create. So was it you that sort of said, hey, here's these real-time bidding processes, here's this data that we can triangulate? Was it you, or were you part of a team? And how did the initiation of, sort of the eye-opening of what that could lead to?
Yep. So the mobile advertising world companies that are involved in creating these audiences are some of the best geospatial intelligence analysts on the planet, and they really defined the notion of how to elicit or extract an intent signal from somebody's location, and looking at those location patterns in context to determine this is a potential audience category of high net worth individuals or individuals with discretionary income, because we see them at European import car dealerships, Orange Theory, and Whole Foods. And understanding that those are intent signals and those are behavioral signals, what we determined, and it was a team, and I'll talk about that, was that these intent signals existed in places like Syria, places like the Turkish-Syrian border. Being able to understand the difference or understand the behavioral patterns of a refugee based upon where we are seeing them is really no different than the way, somebody who's trying to create a rate card for a mobile audience is looking at the intent signals of that high discretionary income individual. And so the community that I was working with just extended what the mobile advertising community does. And so instead of that data ending up on the cutting room floor because a mobile advertiser really couldn't monetize it, there wasn't any demand for it amongst their customers, we picked up that data and did the very same things that mobile advertisers do to understand a cohort based upon their patterns of life. We just did it in these frontier markets where our people were operating and looking for the bad guys and trying to disambiguate bad guy from good guy.
To back up a little bit, we're talking about the ability to take the data from individuals' cell phones through the real-time bidding process, and what is it called inside of your phone? The
advertising ID.
Yes. So my question is, everybody's got a different algorithm based on where they've searched and what they've done and what they said. So when you're talking about this Syrian application, you're talking about folks that all they had to have open was either a weather app or a dating app or any app to help them figure out how the hell to get the hell out of Syria, and they were tracked. So that's interesting because the amount of people operating cell phones is far fewer than most other places on Earth at that moment, probably. That's just my assumption.
That was the first hurdle to prove that there was enough volume of devices and activity in those regions to even be able to determine an audience or a cohort or a type of traveler. And that was when we proved that we had, on any given day, 20, 30, 40 million location hits in a very, very concentrated area. That type of information, without having to fly a satellite or a drone or have intercept gear, to be able to pull that data, to extract it from the RTB, the real-time bidding networks, who, again, that data was on the cutting room floor. They weren't even trying to sell it. That was the pivotal moment, because we were able to prove that we can pull this type of location information as well as significant meta fields from how people were interacting with apps, the type of apps that they had on their phones. We could track a refugee from point of egress into wherever they were fleeing to. In some ways, we could disambiguate between men and women based upon the time in which it took them to travel, the types of facilities they were visiting. A female refugee is probably going to have kids with her, a heavier burden of what she's bringing. And so we could start gleaning those types of very discrete signals of intent and what they needed and why they were fleeing. So doing it in these sort of frontier markets, as opposed to the developed world, Europe, US, Canada, etc., that was a pivotal moment in this integration of commercially available AdTech data, which provided a lot of the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR, that our warfighters are fusing into their targeting applications, their orders of battle.
So when you come back here to America, where there is a lot of expendable income, and referring to your grinder presentation, you went on a road show, lots of data, lots of time on people's hands. I'm curious, like the real-time receptance that happened as you went around speaking to officials.
Yeah. Some interesting conversations amongst the senior executive service within our government, trying to explain to them what Grindr is and why it's a risk.
Come on, like they really don't know what Grindr is, or they're playing coy.
There were some awkward conversations. However, a picture tells 1,000 words. And so, there are multiple applications for this type of data. And the Grindr demonstration was really about an application related to counterintelligence threat. Not that anybody who is a Grindr user is a threat, but the way in which they monetize their app, high precision location data. We were looking at, here is how an adversary might be able to use a commercially available data set to get high fidelity information about somebody with a sensitive position. And this was particularly acute at the time because a Chinese-based private equity firm had acquired Grindr. My question was, why does a country that I think they deny the existence of lifestyles, they have no tolerance for that, but why would they be interested in owning an app like Grindr? And the private equity firm had deep ties to the PRC, and my hypothesis was this is intentional. This just felt malicious. So again, without hacking, engineering, intercepting, doing anything creepy, focusing on that Grindr data set and sort of illuminating how close this touches the US government, particularly sensitive government agencies, the risk is acute because not only can I detect your place of meeting somebody, we were able to draw that data right back to somebody's place of residence.
This is not even 5 years ago. Like, I can't even think of the word just the fact that we didn't know on a large scale that it was this simple.
Yeah, you want to play that Kevin Bacon 7 degrees of separation, mobile location data when it was in its sort of primacy. You could do that all day long and take somebody right to their place of residence where they, what we call bed down, to their primary place of work. I could detect and determine if somebody's into fitness or if they're into race cars or if they're into country music festivals, you name it. That data was very, very adept at coding people into very, very precise audience categories that, you could be coded into 1,000 different audience categories based upon these very discrete intent signals of where you were going. And the ad ID, I described it kind of as a virtual cookie. So everybody knows what a cookie is on a web browser. Cookies don't work on mobile devices. So the platforms, Apple came up with this concept of an ad ID, which allowed mobile applications and advertisers to be able to do the same thing a cookie can do as it's tracking you through your browsing session. The ad ID would track you through your application sessions, and you could track somebody from moving from a weather app to a dating app to whatever app you had on your device, and just track and view that journey both offline, geospatially, where did you go in the real world, and maybe what triggered you to go to that place in the real world. And that was the foundational movement, or that new foundational understanding that mobile advertisers were able to glean from the mobile device and mobile location data, all enabled through this ad ID.
Using this information to track Putin's whereabouts. Can you just talk a little about that?
Yeah. So obviously, did we actually track and identify Putin? No, but certainly the people around him, security detail, aides. We know that Putin is at the Kremlin. Who's at the Kremlin? We know Putin goes somewhere else. What other devices are with him at that time? And building out that sort of that bubble of devices that that orbit him is really what that was all about. But, assume his primary security detail is always with him wherever they are. And those guys obviously are less hygienic with their mobile devices, not so much anymore. But again, when I say back then, we're talking, 5 years ago. And that's just the way the devices came sort of factory installed or factory delivered. The notion of privacy and identity, we were not as sensitive to it, and that has changed. But tracking Putin was really about tracking his entourage and those people that we could reasonably assume would be with him. And if they're with him, that's where he is.
Yeah, well, hey, that's how intel and targets are found. Y'all are poking into Syria. You got grinder data that you're presenting to officials. You've got news out there that you're on to Putin. I'm curious, have you or any of your team have had any weird adversarial threats pointed at you for all of this?
Yeah. So when the article came out, it got picked up by RT, and Putin's spokesperson, who I think is a close friend of his, had to respond. Well, the answer to your question, no, nothing that I have been able to determine is weird, but this is part of their modus operandi. The Russians, they are aggressive. So I am hyper vigilant in little things that may occur. And I've heard stories, and these are verified, of people who have gotten under the radar of the Russians. They haven't been thrown out of buildings, or their planes haven't, suddenly crashed. But things like their Wi-Fi access points were manipulated such that all of the language on all of their devices was now in Russian. Just little things like, hey, we got you. And those things have been verified that have happened to people within the intelligence community who take security very, very seriously.
Yeah, right. So, they're aggressive. So is the United States of America. So now clearly they want to take advantage of this capability. So if I remember correctly, the whole Snowden thing had to do with NSA, let's just say spying on U.S. citizens. And I believe they were doing it through just your old Cat5 cables and whatnot. But at some point, everybody said, hey, let's encrypt those, let's secure those. And the government had to find a different way to access our data. And now at this point, you can legally buy the data from bidding processes, sort of data wranglers or sellers. So the government can get information on any of us.
Yes.
And you posted something recently where they changed the FISA powers. I want you to talk a little bit about this and your thoughts and where this leads.
Yeah. So this may feel or sound sort of contrarian. Most people would assume that I am all for these FISA authorities. They don't even have to buy the data, I don't think. I think they can compel any platform. And, beyond Google, X, Meta, if you are a company that is maintaining data about customers, FISA gives the community, the intelligence community writ large, federal law enforcement, the ability to compel you to surrender data without there being any of the typical due process. So FISA has essentially, cut out this sort of data brokerage market, and they can just go direct and, without necessarily the due process. FISA has just sort of opened up the aperture for a lot of different, sort of, I don't want to call them witch hunts, but uncontrolled examinations of individuals, which I think is a little dangerous because it's a nice, nifty little workaround of the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment was a good guardrail, is a good guardrail from a government that exceeds its authority. So I think we have gotten to the point where we're so hungry for data that we're going to create laws that make the Fourth Amendment just sort of something that needs to be worked around. And that, to me, that's a problem.
It certainly seems like a problem. So at this point, you can't reverse course. I think about myself and I think about my kids, and they've got some apps on their phones. After I read all this, I went through my phone and like, how do you change your app, your ad ID? And I already had most of those security things checked. But I searched, I said, so how do you change your app ID? And it says, well, Apple changes it periodically. It doesn't tell you how often that is. So you don't have any power over how often or if it ever changes. It could be once a year, as far as we're concerned. So how diligent are you about protecting your data and your location and your family's data and their location? And maybe you can give us some tips or something of that sort.
Yep. So thinking about Apple, Apple has made privacy part of their brand. You're paying a premium for an Apple device, and the iPhones have designed privacy into the operating system. Whether you're going to hide your email address, your IP address through relays, these functionality, these capabilities are built into the operating system. So Apple, and to a certain extent, Android, cleaned up their acts in terms of how much of your data is just available openly and to anybody. So I recommend that anybody go through your settings, and if it's a privacy enabled toggle, activate it. Now, I will say that for certain apps, like I use Uber, right? And I don't want to have to go in toggle and reset my phone so that when I need an Uber, I need to like drop a pin and all these things. So I let Uber know my location. When I'm using the app and I open the app, Uber knows my location. It's convenient, and it's a trade-off I'm willing to make. Google Maps. When I need to go somewhere and I don't want to toggle 23 different buttons, I let Google Maps know where I am. I have a certain degree of trust between Google and Uber and Apple where I'm going to let them have awareness of certain things about me. But I certainly don't let Apple track, locations that I visit regularly. They don't need to know that. There's no benefit to me in having that location history available. Nor do I find it beneficial that my ad ID needs to be available, and you can toggle this within the Apple operating system, where my ad ID is available for personalized advertising. So I don't make that available to Apple or to the apps that I use. Now, keep in mind, Apple is the privacy phone, but Apple, they are curating all of this data about you. Android is doing the same. It's the trade-off is, do I want to be totally off the grid and use one of these slick phones that, doesn't have any of the conveniences built into the operating system, or do I want to make those trade-offs? And I think this is about, consumer choice in terms of how convenient do you want your phone? Do you just want it to work when you want an app to work? But I got to tell you, my bank doesn't need to know where I am when I'm making purchases. Amex doesn't need to know where I am when I'm using my Amex card. They can figure all that out based upon the transaction history, but they don't need to know the routes that I'm taking to get to a store or whatever. You think about it in terms of, is there any benefit to me in letting the apps that I allow onto my phone to know all of this stuff about me? And if it's functional to the app, then make that trade-off and make that choice. But in most cases, there's really no benefit to you to let your messaging app know your location.
You could have an attitude to say, oh, well, they're watching me anyway, but why not limit the data points?
I hear people say, well, I've got nothing to hide, so I don't care. Okay, so let's use this example. And again, this is I'm not bringing a political angle into this, but January 6th, some of the things our government has done in order to identify people is if you were in the DC area and you were there with your family during the holiday visiting the Smithsonian and you used your credit card to buy something, maybe you didn't get a knock on the door by the FBI, but you were examined to determine whether you were proximate to the Capitol, whether you were buying signs and posters and whatever other crap people, brought in there, Viking hats, Viking helmets, whatever. And that's where I'm not good with that kind of power, where the government can just say, look, if you were in the vicinity of, we're going to have a look at you. And people who were visiting the Smithsonian with their family had their data, their transaction data from credit cards, airplane tickets, hotel reservations examined by federal law enforcement, which strikes me as
And
being
federal law enforcement are just people. Now know all about those people for maybe no reason at all. I think the number was 13, only 13%. It was either 9 or 13. I'm sorry. I should have wrote it down. 9 or 13% of all iPhone owners toggle that off. Only that many.
and think about the speed of tech and the speed of sort of user adoption. 5 years ago, nobody even knew what an ad ID was. Nobody knew to go into their settings and turn location services off. People who were in the business of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance and cell phone intercept, when I would give them a presentation and show them the patterns of life of their teams, of their people, right down to where they live, how they travel back and forth to work, people who should have known better either thought I was, a charlatan and making it up, or just couldn't believe that I didn't have to hack, engineer, intercept, steal. I just bought this data, put it up in a geospatial map, drew a geofence, and hit play.
I always go back to my kids, and I can easily picture countless different ways for nefarious individuals to be able to use this technology to put geofences around school, to put geofences around fields, to put geofences around neighborhoods. And it's super scary to know that anybody can access this data and do whatever they want with it, because all the tools that you're talking about are, all you have to do is Google them. You can pull down any geospatial tool and figure out how to use it.
Absolutely. And this is where I see this hashtag data for good all over the place. And I'm going to talk about it at this show that I'm speaking at. And the assumption is that if the US government is doing it, then it's not for good, because somebody's going to go to jail or a terrorist is going to be adjudicated. But the Jeffrey Epstein Island, people were traveling there prior to all of this sensitivity to privacy and ways to, trigger your phone so you weren't revealing all of these patterns of life. We've got dead to rights, people who have not been identified, making frequent trips to the Epstein Island. And, is that data for good? I think so.
Listen, there's good and bad all over everything, right? There's light and dark, there's yin and yang. I mean, obviously, I, like you, would prefer less of my data out there. But at this point, we're sort of spewing it out all over the place. So, in your view, is the U.S. government being diligent enough when you talk about national security and using AdTech technology like this to protect us?
So there's always room for improvements. So there's data to be used in applications for targeting or for mission effectiveness, right? I'm looking for bad guys, law enforcement, special agent. I need to find the bad guys. And obviously FISA gives them, all sorts of new avenues to go on a unfocused hunt for data. Then there's from sort of a great powers perspective, where China gets it. They recognize that data as a raw material for either AI or surveillance as a way to affect or to increase their effectiveness in how they govern. These are the types of things that our folks need to be thinking about in terms of data protection. How do we use data to advance the mission of the US? But it's going to require some leveling up of skills, creativity within our senior executive service to really understand what they're talking about, beyond regurgitating tedious metaphors about how data is the new oil. We get that. Yes, now it's time to start refining that oil and making use of it, whether it's through large language models. This is the center of gravity for the data war zone that we're in right now, and China gets it. That's why I think the legislation on TikTok has some benefits and has some value and utility, but at the same time, we should be treating the TikTok issue more like a fair trade issue, because China certainly doesn't trade their data with us or make their data available to us, nor should we. Never really quite saw it as the threat like a grinder, but letting Congress pick and choose which apps are dangerous and banning them. I think that's the wrong venue for that, but probably more relevant to treat it like almost like a trade issue, a fair trade issue.
Yeah, I'm on the same page as you. As much as I detest TikTok, it does seem like a little bit of an overreach on that one. So I'm curious, what are you working on now? Like, do you have any data predictions moving forward?
So what I'm working on, or where I'm focusing now, is really identifying those non-obvious data sets that take AI or AI applications from sort of clever party tricks and interesting sort of applications that do a thing, and accelerating this concept of multimodal AI, where take your experience with ChatGPT or any of the others, where the underlying training data set ends. I think ChatGPT, they trained up to 2019 or something like that. And if you ask a question beyond 2019, it doesn't know the answer. The notion of making AI multimodal, where if it doesn't know the answer, you as the user can provide it with a data set, and then it can add that to its fundamental general intelligence, or it can go out and find the answer through these special data sets that are specific to a question that's in context with what you're looking for, but make these AI systems far more intelligent. This is not getting them to AGI, but getting them to the point where they really have an awareness of their own limitations, and when they hit that limitation, they have the ability to reason and go out and learn.
Instead of making up an answer or saying it doesn't have an answer.
The ability to, in context and in real time, go out and incorporate the auxiliary or the special data that it would need to answer your specific question from an operational perspective, I think is the future of AI. Everybody talks about the importance of the training data, and training data is static. So it's going to learn against this large language model, and then anything beyond that, it's stuck. It's like a human who graduates from college and just decides, yeah, I'm done learning, right? The AI systems need to be able to recognize their limitations and then expand beyond their training data and learn in real time and be able to incorporate that, or have the human machine team on that, where the human can say, here's my special data, can you please incorporate that into your general intelligence to answer these questions? When a human is in sort of this constant state of learning or exposure to new experiences, that's the right place to be. People say this question, what are your superpowers? And my superpower is I'm not afraid to be the dumbest person in the room. When I'm the dumbest guy in the room, I'm learning. When we get to a point where we're not training to a very linear, monolithic set of awareness and intelligence, but it can go out and learn. I think that's the future.
Absolutely. It's a good line. The dumbest guy in the room is always learning.
Yeah.
So, Mike Yeagley, thank you for coming on. This is fascinating. Make sure that everybody turn off your location services on all of your applications on your iPhone. Turn off your ad ID. Be safe. Don't give them your data. They're watching you.
You are the product. If it's free, it ain't free.
I like it. So, Mike, thank you so much. And I hope you have a great summer. And I appreciate your contribution to national security. You really did contribute. It's pretty freaking awesome, man. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Have an awesome day. Take care.
You too. Thanks for having me.